that I am very happy to be in Princeton and to rejoin our journey and to walk freely among my friends. My own journey the last few years has been long and not uneventful. Can you hear back there? Okay. But Princeton and an AHP meeting, I believe, is the perfect place and time to continue our mutual journey. I have been, I think, a humanist psychologist for over 25 years. Much of the time I didn't use that label. I want those of you who are from a younger generation to realize that back in the 1940s and 50s, psychology was really a very different profession. It was tough back then. When I went to graduate school, I was naive enough to believe that, you know what they say in the first page of every psychology text, that the function of psychology is to provide the human species with answers to the basic survival questions and the basic issues of how we can live a harmonious and happy life. After about 1 month at my graduate school and scanning the situation, I came to the dismal conclusion that I was going to learn very little there about my ideals. There seemed to be, and I may be over-exaggerating here, but there seemed to be two bureaucracies that were running the field of psychology. I might even say, is it unfair to say narrow priesthoods? I felt, though, that the younger generation would do something about this, and my second disillusion came as we were getting our doctorates, when in my post-war class of 30 graduate students, there were very few that seemed to remember that it was our job to become the new Freuds, and it was extremely disturbing to me to find most of my colleagues interested in the bureaucratic and the professional aspects of which college had the best tenure system, or which university had the best pension. Can you believe that? There were, however, some voices that restored my innocence and my hope for psychology. And in this list of pioneers who really are responsible for us being here tonight, on the top of this list I'd like to place Harry Stack Sullivan. I don't think that Sullivan has been given the credit that he deserves in history. I tell you, back in the 1940s and 50s, the concept interpersonal relationships exploded like some dangerous drug. Because Sullivan was implying that the real issue, the beginning step in psychology, was that interface where human beings come together. And if you didn't understand that and really engage yourself rather completely in that first encounter, much of what followed would be just the productions of your own ritual or your own thinking. On this list of pioneers, I certainly would place Harry Murray of Harvard, whose breadth and depth brought to our attention the great myths of Jungian philosophy, and who gathered around him at Harvard what were at that time called personologists, who are certainly here with us tonight, at least in spirit. No list of this sort could omit the name of Carl Rogers, who I understand is honoring us with his presence this week. Nor could any such list omit the name of Abe Maslow, or Mike Murphy, who at Esalen brought together dozens and dozens of our colleagues and most important spokesmen. Now, one thing I've learned from all of these people, well, there are two things: an insight and a strategy for humanistic psychology. The insight is this, that probably none of us wants the game to become any bigger than our concept of the game. That is, we all have limits to the realities we will allow and to the possibilities that we will tolerate. To be more precise and neurological, it's possible that the nervous system, when it imprints realities, just can't handle anything that is outside that imprint, which is thus labeled unreal, dangerous, or insane. Now, the strategy which seems to follow from this first premise is this, and I think I've learned it from you, my colleagues. Why don't we define the game as being as big as we can conceive, thus allowing for change and expansion, thus for building in our structure of reality as many options as possible, making our concept of reality as open and relativistic, and more specifically, let us define our reality game to the extent that we can do so in terms of modern science. One way we might define the AHP, and some of us have spent a very hot and difficult week in New York City on talk shows trying to define the AHP, no easy task, as you can understand. One way to define AHP would be to say that it's an attempt to apply Darwinian and Einsteinian theories to psychology. And I find this distinction of Newton versus Einstein to be extremely useful in my understanding of what we can do and where we are going. There are many examples of the Einsteinianization of psychology. We all recall that the doctor-patient relationship was the most sturdy and static Newtonian device. It's one of my legends that I possibly wrote the first PhD doctorate thesis on group therapy. And I want to tell you, group therapy was a very controversial thing about 25 years ago. I recall very clearly talking to a very distinguished clinical psychologist in Berkeley, and when I uttered these dangerous words, group psychotherapy, he looked at me with utter contempt and disdain and said, "My dear fellow, that's a contradiction in terms." The issue of secrecy, I think, is another way of opening up and defining AHP. When I went to Harvard to teach behavior change or personal growth, to try to move us away from this concept of a doctrinaire psychotherapy, at one point I was a capital C consultant and used to go around to the many clinics and hospitals around Cambridge and Boston, and there'd be that typical situation of a conference room with 4 psychiatrists and 4 psychologists and 4 social workers all in a row in decreasing hierarchical status, of course. And each of them would have a large folder in front of them, and each of them would be discussing an absent patient. And when I would suggest that how come the patient wasn't there, or why was it that the person most involved in these records and the person that should have all this presumably valuable information was the last one to get it, again we had a minor Harvard controversy. I think our journey here this week is an example of the Darwinianization of psychology, the very notions of growth and metamorphosis and rebirth, and the notions of myth that Sam Keene and Joseph Campbell will be talking about this week. And most relevant to our meeting tonight and in the next couple of days, the idea of journey, all come from the evolutionary theory applied to psychology. And as we discuss the journey at this point, I would like to pay respect to Bill and Monty Bridges, and to Jack Draw, and to Vin Rosenthal, who have given us this concept of journey, which is an accurate dramatization of an evolutionary situation. I think that our species has reached a point in our long evolutionary journey where and when we are confronted with certain new basic questions in a very common sense and marketplace way. And thus the retrospective and prospective title of my brief remarks tonight, American Culture 1945 to 84. I think that our technological civilization now faces basic directional species questions which formerly could be relegated to the philosophic. What is the purpose of life? Where are we going? What's the goal of the trip? Before 1945, and in countries which have not yet mastered the technologies of the 20th century, four less philosophic issues probably kept our species preoccupied. The biosurvival question, the territorial expansion and control question, the issue of technological competition, and cultural homogenization. I submit that these four challenges in most industrial societies have been solved, and that we now face new questions and new problems. It seems clear that the problems which our species now face are of a new order: overpopulation, energy shortage, scarcity of resource, a general clogging of the social machinery, aimlessness, boredom, escapism, can I say hedonic consumerism, or dare I say narcissistic humanism? In the most advanced nations, the first blind and superficial reaction to these problems has been the Band-Aid policy of growth limitation. Futile attempts to reduce energy use, to constrict our collective aspirations, emphasis on the internal hedonic experience, expressed as erosion of the work ethic. I think, however, that growth restriction and back-to-earth ecology and zero population plans are clearly unsatisfactory answers. I think they're selfish and defeatist and pessimistic. I think that every African and Asian wants technology, wants 2 cars and color TV, and who are we to say that they do not deserve them if they want them? What gets lost in the current debate is the fact that our species is riding an enormous evolutionary brainwave, a gigantic upsurge in energy release, which must be designed for some goal. Now, all the graphs reveal an enormous explosion of human potential. At the same time that every other form of mammalian life on our planet, except the domesticated, is plummeting to extinction, the human energy chart takes off in a 95-degree angle upwards. I believe that the AHP represents a healthy and mutational step towards the use of these energies which are now being released, and a step towards the answering of the basic questions about our journey this week and the journey of our species. I think we are involved in a great mutation which apparently started in 1945, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I think that the 1960s showed us the first post-war generation reaching the age of decision. The tremendous explosion that took place in the 1960s was not entirely accidental. There were many of us back then that quite deliberately, because we were horrified by the robot mass assembly line culture that the Eisenhower years presented us with, quite deliberately set up what might be called one of the largest social psychological experiments in history. Our experimental variable was neurological freedom, freedom of the individual, and our hypothesis was this: if the individual is given control over his body and his brain, a growth process will occur. Now, the 1960s explosion, the trip, the head trip, do your own thing, did produce a state of chaos and anarchy. There were lots of things done in the 60s which were silly and irrelevant, but many very important things came from this explosive decay. Many new concepts of healing, or many old concepts of healing, returned and are now being used by those of you in this room. It's true that many people could not face the responsibility of individual choice and fell back upon reliance on new sects, new cults. But I do believe that a sense of responsibility which must accompany freedom has developed. That passive consumerism of the 60s has been replaced by a sense of discipline. I think that the AHP represents a most laudable attempt to deal therapeutically and responsibly with the energies that were liberated. Look at the program that each of us has been given, the enormous diversity and the differentiation and the individuality of these many energy yogas. As I wander around the halls and look in the rooms of this convention, I'm amazed at the amount of discipline and study and technique and method which is being mobilized. And I say, well done. However, after the praise, I ask this question: is this all? Is our goal to produce a new class of suntanned, organically fed, graceful, polyphase orgasm, self-actualized, somatic technicians? Healing is important, and personal growth is vital. But I think that our society and our species wants more from us. Now, when I read our program, I'm a little disturbed by one fact. I note the almost complete absence of the physical and biological scientists. And I wonder if one of the fallouts of the 1960s was an anti-technological feeling, or even among some an anti-intellectual feeling. And I think that at times I may have, to my dismay, contributed to these two trends. I suggest that one of our many roles and goals in the futures should be this: let us spend more of our time trying to turn on scientists. Let us attempt to eroticize scientists and scientize the erotic. I asked Boulder how we were doing. He said, fine. It's really too hot for this sort of celebration, so I'm going to move very rapidly through the next couple of remarks. After my release from prison, I went to New Mexico and I spent quite a bit of time talking, and that's too fast. After my release from prison, I spent some time in New Mexico at cocktail parties with Los Alamos scientists. They say to me, what are you doing here? And I said, well, I figure it's the same human game any place, so you might as well play it with as smart people as you can. They like that. I found, though, that under the influence of a dangerous drug like alcohol, I found that many scientists will confess that they are closet humanists. You know, we do have a new breed of scientists that were humanized when they were in graduate school in the 60s. You know, when I saw the statistics, I think it was 1967 or 8, that 75% of the Harvard Law School students were smoking grass. I figured if I could hold on for 10 years, the young prosecutors and the young judges and the law clerks would be humanized. So one of my hobbies these days is to attempt to get scientists to think about, when I say to a scientist, I'd like to eroticize science, often they get a blank look on their face, but I want to tell you, their wives understand. You know, one of the most interesting, I've been interested in the psychohistory of scientists, like how come Einstein got to be the way he was. There's one very interesting thing about Albert Einstein. We are told that he was obsessed as a young man with this issue. He was trying to imagine what it would be like if he were a photon. Now, many of us who have experienced some of the recent yogas have had the experience of, experiencing light. But I think that was extremely interesting of Einstein. And of course, once he began thinking and experiencing and personalizing and psychologizing the light process, it's no surprise to me that he was able to quickly write the equations which unify energy and mass and which seem to harmonize space and time. And Einstein was always putting himself in an imaginary elevator, imagining, different rates of acceleration and so forth, and thus came the great specific and general field theory equations of gravity. So here, as I see it, the situation in this bicentennial year 1976. I think we by and large mastered the issue of survival on this planet. And I think that our brave band of humanist psychologists are successfully liberating the individual and offering disciplined responsibility. But what next? I'm sure that each of you has a prospective vision of 1976, 1984. Mine, as most of you know, is SMILE. S-M-I-2-L-E. SM stands for space migration. I square stands for intelligence increase. And LE stands for life extension. Space migration, we believe, can relieve population pressure. It can up-level, in many senses of the word, territorial conflict. It can offer humanity unlimited space, not in uninhabitable planets. Let's face it, it's a swamp we live in down here. And I'm not just talking about the humidity tonight. In other words, there are many of us who've come to the conclusion that gravity is a drag. It's the ultimate bring down. And we want to repeal the law of gravity and replace it, in many senses of the word, by a law of levity. Intelligence increase. Why? Because we believe that modern neurology and humanist psychology and psychopharmacology have in the last decade suggested that the body-brain is a complex biochemical instrument which can be understood and used to define new dimensions of intelligence. Now, when we talk about I square or intelligence increase, we're not talking about doubling the verbal IQ, which after all is simply the acrobatic manipulation of 9 vocal muscles. We're talking about new dimensions of intelligence, and I would dare suggest that almost every one of the seminars in this program of ours is exploring not just an old mode of psychology, but literally a new form of intelligence. Life extension. Well, here's the situation. Microbiology and genetics are deciphering the DNA code and thus providing the possibility for rejuvenation and indefinite life extension. I'm sure most of you saw the New York Times today. The lead article on page 1 reported a research at MIT in which scientists actually constructed a functional gene. There is no scientific reason, I am told, why a healthy person alive tonight cannot extend his or her lifespan for several hundred years. Thus, in addition to unlimited space and expanded brain, our species now faces the challenge of unlimited time. Now, we devised the acronym SMILE to emphasize the very important point that space migration and intelligence increase and life extension go together, and it's suicidal if you try to have one without the other two. Now, let me run through some quick examples. You couldn't have life extension before space migration because we'd have more and more old people, a geriatric population, there'd be no room for the young people, and we'd have the horrible inevitability of John Denver and Frank Sinatra 500 years old at Las Vegas. And Richard Nixon running for the presidency for the 50th time, and probably winning out of boredom. And AHP conventions discussing what? Now, space migration redefines life extension. If we can leave the planet now, a long, long lifetime or selective immortality is simply a tool. There's so much to do up there, so many places to go and things to see, and new social forms to experiment with in these O'Neill cylinders that we're going to have to live a long time, and we won't be so bored. There was a study done, Gallup poll, of attitudes towards life extension. You know, people don't like the idea of living a long time because our culture is necessarily based upon the cult of mortality and death. When they asked people what they thought of living for a long time, most of them said, my marriage can't make it. Similarly, we have to double, triple, multiply our intelligence if we're to migrate into space, because if we don't, we'll simply be taking the same old dull games up there to play over and over again. Galactic cowboys and Indians, huh? We believe that intelligence rises to the occasion, and when space migration starts to happen and life extension is possible, it's inevitable that we'll get smarter faster. Now, I do want to tell you, and this may be just my biased and prejudiced experience, but I do sincerely tell you that if you get too smart in a society of domesticated primates, you can be in trouble. There are some among us who believe that most educational practices in our society and all societies today are systematic ways of keeping us stupid. Now, tonight's meeting is no place, nor is the humidity an atmosphere to discuss the details of and the arguments pro and con space migration, intelligence increase, and life extension. On Monday evening at 7:30 in Alexander Hall, I will be meeting with Bill Augusto, who is an L5 scientist. L5 is the society. How many of you in this room know what L5 Society is? That's extremely interesting. L5 Society is an organization of space migration people who have gotten together to back the hardware designs and the economic plans of Professor Gerard O'Neill of Princeton.
Yes.
I have higher intelligence from Galaxy Center on the phone. She wants to know what we want to know. Okay, we'll call you back.
Sure you announce that on Tuesday night because Carl Rogers is on Monday night.
Okay. All right. Okay. That's Tuesday night at 7:30 Alexander Hall because Carl Rogers is on Monday night in Alexander Hall. Rather than go on with this one-sided soliloquy, I suggest that tonight is the place and time to celebrate our reunion, joining together as in times past when, in the words of Karen Kahan in our program, music and splendor of the ceremonies aroused a strong tide of emotion that was shared by all hearts in unison. I think another function of our reunion could be to stimulate in each other some great and noble visions for our future. It is for this reason, and not to provoke polarity, that I offer you in closing the parable of the 5 caterpillars just before metamorphosis who saw their first butterfly. This is, by the way, a shaggy caterpillar story. It started as 3 and then 4 and now it's 5. Now, see the 5 caterpillars are each on their big leaf on the twig of the tree that they fought for, and it's their tree and their twig. And they look up and they see their first butterfly, and the conservative caterpillar says, well, that's immoral and illegal. We should bust those butterflies and put them down here in cages. The technical caterpillar says, they'll never get me up in one of those. The liberal, progressive caterpillar says, why, that's disgraceful when there are caterpillars in Bangladesh that don't have color television. Well, who's left? Oh yeah, the Oriental occult caterpillar said, well, why bother with all that technology when I can curl up in the lotus position and astral travel? And the religious caterpillar said, if God had intended caterpillars to have wings. Thank you.
The old Tim. What? Yeah, it's too cumbersome anyway. I'll just as I wrote to Tim, that if it were true that his bail had been reduced from 5 million to 5,000, I knew it would be a great blow to his ego. But neither a blow to his ego nor LSD has been able to dull his intelligence nor his wit. Tim, thank you very, very much.